Thank you so much. It's a great intro. Good morning. I'm here today to share a little bit about my journey in learning about how inclusion shapes the world around us, especially through the lens of design. But in this, I invite each of us to think of all the places in our lives where we design, the choices that we make to create an experience for another person, whether or not that's our official title at work. So what I found is that inclusion has really not only shaped the world around me and the ways of recognizing that, but also me as a designer. And I wanted to share a little bit of the history on how that's come together for me. People often ask, how did you get into this topic of inclusion, or how did this come to be? All of us could tell different journeys, I think, in how we arrived in this room today. For me, I was born and raised in a city called Oakland, across the bay from San Francisco. And it was a place where, much like Toronto, we prided ourselves on many different types of diversity. Diversity of race, national origin, language, sexual orientation, religion, all of it was part of the conversation as I was growing up. But for all those conversations about diversity, I rarely learned the fundamentals of accessibility, and rarely had conversations about disability. And I find that to be so strange because disability and ability is one of those facets of human diversity that spans every other kind of human diversity. We're all born and we gain abilities as we grow, and then we lose those abilities as we age. And even as we're moving from one environment to the next, things we can see and hear, how we move is constantly changing because of our environment. So one of my commitments is to bring disability to the top of our conversation about diversity, because I think it opens up another kind of conversation about what's possible. My path to design also started somewhat here. This is in the 4th grade, my science project, where I'm using a sculpture to communicate how earthquakes work. And for me, art and science have always kind of been the same tool. They're about understanding the world around me, communicating what I'm learning, and sharing that and connecting with other people. I went on to study orthopedic biomechanics and material science engineering in college. And I wanted to create prosthetic designs for people as a way to fit technology to a human being. From there, let's fast forward many, many months. I started a course in a field that had nothing to do with what I had studied. And I found my way eventually to Microsoft, where I had the opportunity to develop a pretty deep practice for myself and then also for a larger team around inclusive design. And it's a term that's been around for many, many decades, but bringing that into the environment, the digital environment, what does digital transformation mean in the context of inclusive design was something that we found was really useful to the work that we'd done, but then also was resonating with a much broader community of people. And so I quit my job in 2017 to go spend time with many other companies and talking about this topic. And here's just a few snapshots of places that I've had the opportunity to work and meet with people. City of Detroit, Facebook, Airbnb, Scholastic, Mattel, a lot of big tech companies, and a lot of recreational and facilitated kind of environments that we all participate in. And so, in that, we found that inclusion means many different things to different people. And so I wanted to take a closer look at the root word, which is claudere, which is Latin for to shut. So exclusion is literally to shut out, and inclusion is to shut in. And I started to wonder if there was something about the shut-in, shut-out mental model that was shaping how we thought about solutions. In this model, if you're on the outside, is the goal to break into that circle and gain access to whatever's on the inside? Or if you're on the inside, is it to magnanimously open the circle and create room for more people to come in? Or is it to get rid of the circle altogether? And then I started to think, maybe there's something about the circle itself that was stopping our thinking. A couple of ways that this kind of circle between in and out shows up in our world. This is an example of an overpass with it's designed outside of New York City. It's designed in the 1940s and 50s by Robert Moses, who was known as the master builder of New York City. He was the Park City Commissioner for decades. And Moses was also demonstrably racist, and it was pretty well documented in a book called The Power Broker by Robert Caro. And one of the practices shown here is the underside of this overpass is 7 feet 7 inches high, which is just low enough that a public bus can't travel underneath it. And public transportation being a primary mode of getting around for working class African American families and families of low income, in effect became a barrier to participating in the beaches and parks on the other side of that overpass. So these kind of barriers exist in many areas today as well. I would say probably, this is a conservative estimate, 70% of websites don't meet basic accessibility criteria. In essence, the same kind of barrier to information and access to society that that bridge has created, but for people who require assistive devices or assistive technology in accessing the internet. So a moment that really broke this shut-in, shut-out model or thinking for me was the World Health Organization's definition of disability, which in 2001 they dramatically redefined as a mismatched interaction between the features of a person's body and the features of the environment in which they live. And this definition squarely put the responsibility on me as a designer and my peers as we were making choices that shape the world around us. We were increasing or decreasing those mismatches between people and the world around them. And started to think about mismatches as building blocks almost of exclusion. There are communities, there's individuals who encounter a high degree of mismatches as they move through the world every day, and those mismatches build up over time to lead to certain types of exclusion. So I wanted to know if we could start to break those down and where were those coming from. One of the culprits is what I've come to call ability biases, which is when we make something that we ourselves can see, hear, or touch, or it maps to how we learn or how we process information. And it ends up working well for people who have the same preferences or abilities, but ends up excluding a much broader group of people. Some examples of this, I travel a lot, so I spend a lot of time in airport bathrooms. This is a toilet with a sign on the back that says, "Wave hand over the sensor to activate." Now, this design in particular would require either having a hand or being able to read this sign, being able to read English in particular, being able to have the degree of balance to reach over. But anybody who doesn't match that design would experience a mismatch in interacting with the solution. Anybody who couldn't see the features of this toilet would experience a mismatch. So mismatches can also be the starting point for innovation. This is a good example of inclusive design. One of the earliest ones is the flexible straw. Joseph Friedman was at a milkshake counter with his young daughter, and she was having a hard time drinking out of a straight paper straw. He took that home, put a screw inside of it, wrapped a wire around the outside, and created the first flexible joint in a straw. This is a design that went on to benefit many more people, not just children, but it's an essential device for a number of people with disabilities. It also has benefited any of us who've been reclined ill in bed, or maybe even on a beach somewhere, vacation, enjoying a beverage. Another favorite example of inclusive design is the typewriter, which was invented by Pellegrino Turri and the Countess Carolina Fontani di Fivizzano. And thank you. I'm sure I did not say that right. So the two of them were very, very dear friends. Some were more than friends. And the Countess was blind. And when they were apart in the early 1800s, if you wanted to author a letter to another human being and you were blind, you'd have to dictate that letter to someone who would transcribe it for you, which is not a great solution if you want private communication. And so the two of them worked together to create the first typewriter so that the Countess could author her own letters. And it goes without saying that many of us have benefited from this design in some way, probably carrying something in our pockets or our bags right now that is a great, 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 great grand-descendant of that original design. So there's many of these types of technologies and innovations in our environment that we may not know started with design for mismatch and exclusion, and specifically with and by people with disabilities or people who experience a high degree of exclusion. And what I also love is that these aren't just stories of innovation, but these are stories of love between two people, or they wanted to connect and they found a way to bridge that mismatch through an innovation. I want to understand, can this happen as a repeatable practice? Is it a happy accident, or can we do this in an intentional way? And what we're finding is that we all experience exclusion in more ways than ever before, especially as our technologies become a more entrenched part of our lives. And when we design something that works well for perhaps this left column, someone who experiences a high degree of mismatch because of a disability or other types of differences in diversity, if we design something that works well, let's say for someone who is born with one arm, that design could go on to benefit someone who is temporarily has an elbow injury, or also maybe holding a cup of coffee or a newborn child. And so this way of designing first and foremost for the person who experiences the highest degree of exclusion can benefit many more people. So back to this shut-in, shut-out model, I started to think that maybe it was more of a cycle of choices that we're constantly making. This relationship between these elements of who makes our products, what we make, why we make them, our assumptions about who uses them, and then how they're made with the tools that we use. So I quickly want to show a couple of examples from each of these. As we think about the design of a, let's say, playground, this is the kind of swing that I grew up with. If we were asked what kind of abilities are required to use this design, you certainly have to be a certain height, probably 2 arms, 2 hands, 2 legs maybe even. And as we start to map that out, we start to realize that this design is designed for a very specific kind of person. And if we were to fill a playground only with this kind of swing, it would, the only people who would show up to play are people who match that design, because it indicates who's it for and who's it not for, that playground. I wanted to understand how do we come to this place where such that standard approach to standardized design was shaping our environments. This is a bell curve. I certainly learned this when I was in school. The myth of designing for the quote-unquote average person or normal human being, that if we did that, then we would benefit 80% of the population, and the other 20% would, over time, come into the environment, be included over time. And it simply isn't true. The origin of that bell curve, as it's applied to human beings, comes from Adolphe Quetelet, and there's a really good detailing of this work in a book called The End of Average by Todd Rose. But Quetelet was a mathematician and astronomer. He was the first one in the early 1800s to really measure bodily dimensions. And human beings in all different aspects then grew into all different aspects of society. He created tests for morality, intellect. He just went on and on and on. And what Quetelet found is he mapped the data, largely from the region of Belgium and the surrounding areas of Europe where he was at this time, that it mapped to a bell curve, and he was astonished. And Quetelet made an assertion that was one step further. He said the center of that bell curve was the average human being and the perfect human being. And any degree of deviation from that center was a degree of abnormality. Now, that idea stuck really hard in our society. It shaped how we design, it shaped how we think about body mass index, which is also known as the Quetelet index. But what if it just wasn't true? What if it was an idea that started in the 1800s and we've carried it along maybe a little bit longer than we should? And what if there was no such thing as a normal human being? What would we do? How would we design? One of my favorite examples comes from the United States Air Force. We were creating the first flight deck, also known as a cockpit for an airplane. The Air Force took measurements of about 4,000 pilots and took the average of those dimensions and said, oh, that must be the perfect pilot. Let's design everything fixed into place, chairs, controls, everything. And what they found is that pilots, that they had quite a few crashes and catastrophes that they couldn't attribute to pilot error or mechanical failure. And in preparation for the Korean War, a young researcher named Lieutenant Gilbert Daniels went back and revisited that data to see how many, he just took 10 dimensions that they had previously measured to see how many people in that Air Force at that time matched all 10 dimensions. And what he found was that nobody matched all 10 dimensions. That in essence, the Air Force had created a fighter jet for everyone and no one. And this happens all the time in the technology that we design when we make assumptions about an average human being, that it ends up mapping to a place where no one actually is. This led to what's known as the individual fit principle, adjustable seatbelts, adjustable chairs, adjustable controls. And in that adjustment, it wasn't just about creating a safer airplane, it was about fundamentally changing who could be a pilot. When that design changed, many people of very different abilities and bodies could participate. So, quick story about gaming here to kind of tie back what we make and who uses it. I think I'm going to run out of time. I'm looking at the clock. Quick story. So John Porter is a contributor to the book who wrote MISMATCH. And John has a wall where he's hung up every type of video game console controller since the beginning of time. And he calls it his wall of exclusion because every controller has required 2 hands to play. And John doesn't have 2 hands to play. He plays primarily through speech commanding and a really wide range of custom controls that he's created to fit his body and abilities. And when you think about the world of gaming, there's so many different roles, these vast worlds you can participate in, and the idea that those are gated by a little piece of plastic that requires 2 hands is kind of a silly idea. And so one of the ways that John, who's a designer at Microsoft, so we have a nice thread here today, has worked with the team there as to open up the design process to a wide range of disabled gamers, working with organizations like Veterans, Warfighters Engaged and Able Gamers to participate in the design process of the Xbox Adaptive Controller, which you see here in the middle, which now interfaces with dozens of different types of controllers that anybody can choose to fit their own body and abilities, and then it maps to the games they want to play. Another quick story, Tiffany Brown, who, first time I met her, she told me something I never forget, which is that in the history of licensed architecture in the United States, only 400 architects have been both female and African American, which is 0.3% of the profession. And this matters because the choices that are made on how our cities are shaped and what spaces are built and rebuilt are gated by those levels of profession. Now, it also matters in the city of Detroit. This is Tiffany's hometown, and it's the place of the first public housing projects in the United States, here shown on the left, the Brewster Douglas Homes. Detroit, like many cities in the United States, has a history of tearing down Black and African American neighborhoods to rebuild in quote-unquote pursuit of economic opportunity and development that often never materializes. And over the decades, it's shaped the racial distribution of our cities. On the right-hand side is an image from the 2010 census of the racial distribution of Detroit. And on one side, you can see the blue dots denote the Black and African American population of the city, and the red dots denote the white and Caucasian population. And these lines between them are roadways, waterways, and physical structures that have taken shape over time to create these kind of barriers. So it runs really deep in the way that our cities are built. Ways that someone like Tiffany and many Detroiters are shifting that paradigm is introducing young people of color to the profession of architecture. She has an initiative called 400 Forward, raising awareness for the next 400 African American architects and female architects. And then also as an architect herself, the neighborhood that she grew up in was torn down when she was 15. She's returned to that neighborhood and is working with people from her original community and people she grew up with to rebuild that area. And this is a picture from her grandmother's front porch. So a couple more quick points. One is, as we think about how we make the tools that we use, this is Wanda Diaz-Merced, who's she's an astronomer, grew up in Puerto Rico, and over the course of university progressively lost her eyesight, which is a very big deal if you're an astronomer because most of the data that's collected is analyzed visually. So Diaz-Merced, in pursuit of maintaining a world-class practice of astronomy, applied sonification to the data she was collecting, meaning she applied sounds, different tones to different types of radiation she gathered, even instruments, creating, in essence, these star songs that she could analyze auditorially. And what she's found is that many astronomers are now also adopting this practice because using something auditory in combination with a visual analysis gives many people a different kind of depth and understanding of the data that they're collecting. And my last point on the cycle, why we make. So this is an image of Morgan's Inspiration Island in San Antonio, Texas. Morgan Hartman and her parents had a hard time finding places for her to play as a child. She has a combination of physical and sensory disabilities. And they set out to create the most inclusive water park in the world, which I think they successfully accomplished. Some of the features you see here, there's a chair the child's using that is powered by compressed air, so it can go anywhere in the park. And then also the water itself is adjustable in real time. The temperature is adjustable for children with sensory needs that we can adapt it in real time. And what I love about this example is they didn't just create a wheelchair accessible park. They created an environment, a beautiful environment, where any child could come and have a sense of adventure, discovery, make new friends. And when I think about the environments that each of us touch, the choices we make, and the way that that shows up in the world, that every little moment ladders back to that sense of belonging, ultimately. And it leads me to my favorite definition of inclusive design, which comes from Susan Goldsman, who was a playground designer and a mentor. She said that inclusive design isn't designing one thing for all people. It's designing a diversity of ways for people to participate in an experience with a shared sense of belonging. And that just opens up a new way of thinking about the things that we make and the choices that we make and how that shapes the world around us. And so the key piece as we think about this cycle, people often ask, where's the best place to start? Is it with my team? Is it with my product? And I'd say, choose any of these as a starting point. Just jump in. But the key piece is to start by recognizing what exclusion looks like in those environments that we create. And then opening up our processes to the contributions of communities who've experienced that exclusion at a high degree over time. And that will fundamentally, from their expertise and their innovation, change the way that we make and that we think. So it starts with questions like, who might have the most to lose with the changes that we make? What kind of feedback is missing from our channels? Who experiences the most exclusion? And with those simple questions, we could start to find that path. So this and many more stories are in the book that published last year called MISMATCH, a closer look at some of the practices in here and other stories of innovation from inclusive designers and the ways that they're shifting the world around us. And my invitation is that each of us, any of us, can step into this practice, starting with our own experiences with exclusion and listening for that in others, and then opening up our processes in a way that other people can contribute to the things that we make. And we also have some stories at mismatch.design if you're interested in learning more about some of those resources. Thank you so much.